It is Friday, June 29th. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people. We look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and a look forward to our ongoing battles for autonomy and our free and independent existence. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation and simulcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandanega. You can find us at www.ltnradionet.com for our audio, and we also stream audio 24/7 on that same site, replays of old shows. We're live when we're live. And of course, we are streaming live here on Facebook. I am John Kane. I'm the show's host and producer, and I'm joined by Ed Schindler. And it's great to have Ed Schindler back in the studio. You're kind of always here anyway, because when I give credit to sponsors and the like, it is clear that you are one of the folks that supports the show and has always supported the show. And I think because of that support, we've like I said, we've been at this. We're in our 9th year now. Can you believe that? Nine years. Yeah, it's incredible. Look, I also want to give props out to Kelly McMillan, who is our studio engineer, who is responsible for our setup, and we're hoping to work some things out and improve some of the things that we're doing here. Maybe do some equipment upgrades and that kind of thing. We're always trying to stay in front, and and I think the folks that we work with help us do that. So, but first and foremost, I want to thank Ed Schindler for making it back to our studios, and I think our conversations with each other offer a kind of a unique look, because you and I, while we agree on many issues, we have oftentimes a different perspective on how we approach those issues, and I think that makes the conversation. Like I said, we aren't singing in unison; we're singing in harmony, I guess, as we talked about it earlier here. What I want to talk about today is something that I feel like I've got to almost clarify, because even as I talk about fighting for our autonomy, sovereignty is the word that we always use, which I'm becoming a little bit indifferent about. But the idea of fighting for our rights and what we can do, oftentimes, I know it can come across, and I can come across as somebody who is always condemning the fact that the folks in the past may or may not have done this or may or may not have done that. But I want to be clear here. I know the resistance that was put up in the past, and what I want to talk about today is not just comparing that resistance, but let's call some of it out. Let's call out what the folks who came before us did to stand up to what I would say was a more formidable force than sometimes what we face. We know that we can stand up to the state today, and we can be pretty bold about it. I mean, I know there were beatings and there were fights in the 90s and certainly the 80s and the 70s. But today, I think we live in a world, especially with social media and so many other things, that we can hold our own even against a disproportionate foe like the state or the federal government. But back in the day, we know how ruthless New York State was. All of the states. We know what they did. We knew how they could silence things and how they could hide things from the media, and how complicit the media might be with that. I mean just only back in the 90s. We know what the state or the province. I mean, so this goes for our territories on the other side of the imaginary line too. We know how ruthless the provincials were, and the states were, and the federal governments, Canadian and U.S. federal governments. And as much as the people of the past did oppose and did resist some of the things that the state and federal governments and provincial governments tried to do to our people, they knew that they could only take the fight so far, because at the end of the day, as ruthless as the state and the province and the federal governments were, they would just kill us. And we know that would be a much harder thing for the and not that someone wouldn't want to through it. Trust me, in Standing Rock, those police would have loved to have just mowed people down. Make like Israeli soldiers shooting down on Palestinians. They would love to get away with that, but they knew they couldn't. And we know that they could. But I mean, Ed, we talked a little bit earlier. Even things like our fight with gaming, you only have to go back to 2013 and realize that the powers that be here at the Seneca Nation believed that they had to play nice with the state. They had to settle their disagreement over revenue sharing, because if they didn't, then the state might not renew the compact. And the fear was that the state still had the power, even just a few years ago. The belief was that the state had the power to shut down the largest employer in Western New York, just out of vindictiveness. And of course, many of us, not all of us, because I think some people still think that the state has that power, but many of us know better than that. But I think what I really want to talk about isn't just gaming or just 10 years ago. I want to go farther back, because as we've looked at things like jurisdictional fights, for instance, that oftentimes go back to resting on federal statutes like U.S. 232 and 233. I think that we forget that those people, and not just here in Seneca Territory, but all the territories, were strongly opposed to that, and they spoke out against it. They condemned this notion that the federal government could bestow concurrent jurisdiction on to the states on our territories. We didn't accept it. So even though we opposed it and made our statements very, very clear, the state just went along like they had the power to do it. So as I point out how those people who are representatives in many of our territories stood to oppose that back then, we haven't picked that fight back up. We might fight about jurisdictional issues. I mean, and we're quick to cite a treaty or something like that. But the reality is, we're also quick to call the cops. We're quick to use the outside court system. U.S. 232 and 233 is about the federal government giving to the states jurisdiction over civil and criminal matters on our territories, in New York State specifically. That's what U.S. 232 and 233. The leadership at the time on all our territories opposed it. Yet, we don't fight that battle still. So my point is, as much as we could condemn the length to which those that came before us took those fights, we fought other battles. We'll fight about taxation, but we haven't picked up the battles that those guys really laid some groundwork for us to follow. And part of the reason it comes to mind has to do with our buddy Matt Hill.
Yeah,
you recall, because you were there with Matt when he was fighting, even getting a speeding ticket here on the territory. What you guys were laying out to the court here, that was Collins.
Yeah, Collins.
What you guys laid out is that you guys have nothing that suggests that you have any legitimate claim to jurisdiction. And when they mentioned 232 or 233, if they even mentioned that, you guys were already prepared to say, no, we've got all the documentation here. The Seneca Nation never accepted that. Just because you say that you passed a law was passed doesn't mean that we consented to it.
And that was one of the things that we brought up was, where did you get it? And they mentioned 232 and 233, and it was put to them, where did they get the right to do this?
Yeah, I mean, and so it's a circular reason that they can empower themselves, even though they claim to be a government that is that derives its power from the consent of the governed. So they want to govern over us, but then not fulfill that that promise, so to speak, that they would only get their power from consent. We never consented to that. In fact, it is clearly documented at that time that the leadership in all of our territories, not just here in Seneca Nation, but it's pretty well documented here, absolutely oppose that. So I applaud that. I'm glad that when I look back at 232 and 233, we can find that. But I'm also glad that we can find the opposition to the Thruway. We can find the opposition to Route 17, the opposition to some of the Salamanca issues, the Kinzua issues, the opposition that was lodged against many of the easements and that kind of stuff. I mean,
the railroads.
The railroad, all of that stuff. So even though we may not have won those battles, or persevered, I should say. It's hard to know what a winner and a loser is, but even though we may not have persevered in that resistance, it is important to know that we did resist. Our people did resist back then, and for me, it's real easy for us to say, "Oh, we're strong now. We resist now." Where in the past they didn't. No, that's not true. They did resist, but again, their opponent, their foe, the state and federal government, was a completely different animal. And by animal, I mean that might be an insult to animals, I guess, because they didn't play fair. I mean, they didn't follow rule of law. They did things like 232 and 233, where they just asserted power that they have no way of justifying where that power comes from.
It's really important to look at because the lease of Salamanca was done more than 120 years ago.
Yep.
Okay, in which the state literally just combined all the different leases on territory that was called Salamanca. They combined them into one lease, and then said that they had to be perpetuated forever.
Well, and what they tried to suggest, and they actually had language in there to say, well, especially when it comes to with Native people, a lease is like a sale. I mean, they actually use that language. Mm-hmm. No, a lease is never like a sale. Unless it's a sale, it's not a sale. It's a lease. And the fact that the states and municipalities and land companies could actually enter into leases for 99 years is really kind of bizarre, because I don't even think that they can do that anymore. And some of those leases, going back farther, were illegal because they tried to do them for 999 years. How could you possibly enter into a lease for 999 years?
The thing that really stopped them on their argument about a sale was the federal government, because the federal government stepped forward to the state of New York and said you had no authority to purchase Indian territory. The federal government claims they're the only ones that has the right to acquire Indian territory, and then Native Americans have said all along, you don't have the right to acquire our territory unless we agree to it. And that means the people, not the council, not the president. The people have to agree to it. So that threw the state off right there.
Well, absolutely. And I think as we sit here, and again, as a guy who I think, I'm full of all this fight and all this resistance, and we live in a time now where even the non-native public is part of their mantra is resist, because of their opposition to the current president and administration and the way things are going. But while we talk about resistance, we can forget how strong the resistance was. I mean, what guys like Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Niskahe and others, yes, what they represented. Because it's real easy to think that we're doing everything right and the ones that came before us didn't. But it's not true. The fact that we even have we have the grounds to fight on today, the fact that we have a foundation to fight on, part of that is what was maintained by the folks that came before us. Because even though they may not have persevered, just like the folks in Standing Rock didn't persevere in their resistance to a pipeline, the point is you put up your fight and you live to fight another day. And sometimes you can circle back around to those same issues. What I will say about this generation, about us, is we have not circled back around to pick up the frankly the fight or the torch that those that came before us did. And I'm starting to see. I say that, but it's like seeing the Seneca Nation, for instance, begin to post some resistance to the Thruway in that
right.
easement, filing a suit against against the Thruway. To me, okay. Now, this many years, when was the Thruway approved? In the 50s or something like that?
48.
I mean, the idea that only now it is. I'm not condemning that it's happening now, but there was clear resistance to the Thruway back then, and the Senecas knew they got cheated by the state, but they also, in that circumstance, felt like the state would terminate the Seneca Nation and would just try to eliminate us with the stroke of a pen.
Yeah, it's really important to take a look at U.S. policies back 48 through 60. They were terminating Indian nations, literally taking their land, literally eliminating them as being recognized as Native American. And so you have to look at what they had to fight up against, because the state and the federal government were both willing to do that. And therefore you had to be careful because you don't know what they're doing. I'd like people to understand something very important.
Just to interrupt you, what we hear all the time is saying, "Oh, they can't do that."
Yes.
Well, look, we can say that, but we see every day where politicians and governments do things that are unlawful, immoral, unethical all the time. So it isn't enough to just say, "Oh, they can't do that," because they do, they have, they did, and they will.
Yes. A lot of people complain about U.S. history. Say, for instance, slavery. They say that was wrong. And the fact of the matter, it may have been wrong, but it was legal. In the United States, it was legal. Okay, and you got to be able to concern yourself with what you're going to be fighting against, because legalities. Take, for example, today, people are upset with the Trump administration for taking children. Okay, and there's a lot of things that they could look at. And they're trying to resist that. They're trying to fight against it. Well, it was the same thing back then with the people from all the nations, all the Indian nations, Native Americans. They were trying to stop the abuse that was happening, the oppression that was happening from both federal and state governments.
Well, and again, to your point about what was legal and what was right almost have never been on the same page. I mean, there are things every day. I mean, Donald Trump became the president of the United States without winning the majority of the vote. I mean, he legally and according to that system, legitimately won the presidency. But it doesn't make any sense. I mean, slavery was legal, but it was always wrong. It wasn't right for the first 150 years of the United States or 100 years of the United States. It wasn't right. It was just legal. I mean, the abuse of children and women, and obviously, what Native people. It was legal to kill Indians, to kill Native people. I mean, to get paid bounty. That was legal. It was never right, but it was legal.
Let me share with you I don't know how many people have heard the term off the reservation.
Yeah.
And it refers to someone acting kind of wild and crazy.
Yeah, when they use it now,
off the reservation.
when they say somebody's off the reservation, it means that they are not conforming, that they are somehow, it's a pejorative. It's meant to insult somebody, that such and such has gone off the reservation.
Yes. Well, people don't realize historically the reason that people acted that way was because if an Indian, Native American was found off the reservation, it was legal to kill him.
They were considered a hostile. See, the whole reservation system, and that may not apply here necessarily, but out west when the whole reservation system was established, they were like concentration camps or prison camps, prisoner of war camps. So if somebody left the confines, they would they had gone off the reservation. That means that they were a wild Indian, as they called them. They were a hostile, and it was legal. It was legal to kill them. And so, just by virtue of not, submitting to the imprisonment that these reservations represented, was essentially could be a death sentence.
And that's why the person was scrambling like crazy to get back on the reservation.
Yeah. trying to save their own lives, or they would have to conduct themselves while they were off the reservation in such a way to avoid capture and all kinds of other things. So, but this is, again, I think to your point about the difference between something being legal and being right. As we look back at the resistance that those that came before us put up, it is important to know that there was probably an even wider disparity between what was legal and what was right. Not just 100 or 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but going all the way back through. So, when we're fighting the throughway, there's a real consequence to putting up that resistance. And so I think lodging your resistance and establishing your position on that, on 232 and 233, on the Citizenship Act, no territory here in the Haudenosaunee territories accepted or consented to the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Now, think about that. So no territory consented to the overarching, unilateral, declaring that we, as individual members of our peoples, were being denationalized and essentially having their nationhood enforced or pressed on us. I mean, it was universally rejected, and yet that's 1924. We're not in less than 100 years later. You go to any one of our territories and ask how many people. Ask. I dare you to take a poll and ask if you're a U.S. citizen. I guarantee you're going to have native person after native person after native person. Oh yeah, I'm a U.S. citizen. I mean, so even though our leadership and the people who represent us and the grassroots, everybody were unilaterally opposed to the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, we have conceded to that now. Now, I'm not saying all of us have. I mean, but I think if you were to go through the territory and say and find out how many people say no, I'm not a U.S. citizen. I'm Seneca, or I'm Mohawk, or I'm Onyotaaga, or I'm Gunyakaaga, or I'm Onundawaga. You're going to find more people who say, well, yeah, I'm that too. But I mean, look on our territory. How many American flags are flying? I guarantee there are more American flags flying here in Cattaraugus than Seneca Nation flags.
Right.
I guarantee it. I remember one day during the fall festival, Matt and I were watching the motorcycles. They all had American flags on them. Every one of them. I didn't see a single Unity flag or Warrior flag, and I saw only a couple of Seneca Nation flags. But every one of those motorcycles, every one of those guys on their Harley and their big bikes felt compelled to put an American flag. And this was during the Seneca Nation Fall Festival. So again, I think it's important to give credit where credit is due, because there was resistance in the past. Mm-hmm. And I would say some of that fight that they laid the groundwork for, we failed to pick back up. And I don't mean just us, but I mean the folks between us and them. There's been generations that have come through and said, "No, we're just going to accept it now. We're U.S. citizens. They said so now we are." And I think so. As we enter, as we resist today, as we look at what we call decolonization and our fight for our autonomy and that kind of stuff, look, we can use words like decolonization all we want, but if we aren't prepared to revisit even some of those fights that folks before us laid down, I just think that we can be in a situation where where we're conceding too much. Charles Cater weighed in. Yeah, we have all of these sections of not only state law and U.S. law, but even on the Canadian side, the Indian Act. How many native territories have accepted some of those laws that we rejected in the first place? But we come to a place where we ignore that fight and we move on to something else, when you really can't. I mean, I don't know how we can, pretend that 232 and 233 are okay. I mean, this isn't just about Matt trying to fight a speeding ticket. It's much more than that. Yet, on the way here, I'm picking you up to bring you to the studio. What did we pass? There were sheriff's cars, there were state troopers, there were all kinds of law enforcement vehicles at a house just down the road from here.
And Seneca Nation Marshals, which is adapted from the Caucasian.
Well, it's at least the Seneca Marshals. Their origins are out of the Seneca Nation Constitution, which again was drafted by white men. But it's not. They aren't a law enforcement. They aren't enforcing New York State law like in Akwesasne.
Yeah,
the tribal police up in Akwesasne, they're enforcing New York State law. I mean, so that is the absolute hypocrisy that exists in some of our territories. And even as we try to fight and develop grassroots battles over sovereignty issues, over jurisdiction issues, over taxation, over our children, our children's education, resources, land use, and some of that land use, even to do things like revisit again leases, whether it's easements that utility companies are using, or easements that the Thruway Authority is using, or any of the other state roads or U.S. roads that go through our territories.
In Salamanca.
Yeah, no, Salamanca, absolutely. So,
And,
I mean, these, okay, somebody asked me what 232 and 233 is. U.S. 232 and 233 was a U.S. statute that was passed that where the federal government granted New York State civil and criminal jurisdiction over native territories. And it lays out the details of that. It was modeled after what was done in many other states, like Oklahoma and the Major Crimes Act and some of those other things that were more broad-based. But 232 and 233 were specific to New York State. So for those of you who don't know that, that's what that is. But again, I think it's really important to know that our people didn't take it lying down at the time, but over time, we have become complacent. And so, as much as we might feel good waving our warrior flags and making signs and standing up to pipelines and stuff like that, there are a whole bunch of battles that we left, that we never have picked up the mantle again.
There's one battle I think that's very important because it's affecting the other ones, and that's regarding education, because the children are being indoctrinated. They do the pledge to the flag every morning. They learn all these American things and basically identify as being American, and they don't identify as being Haudenosaunee or Anundawaka because it's not taught in the school. Okay.
Well, and even when native quote unquote culture is taught in the schools, it's actually teaching like we were. It's almost like an Amish thing, right? Like we're going to teach about you at a specific time in history. We're not going to talk about your history from now. We're not going to talk about your modern history. We're going to paint a nice picture of what Haudenosaunee culture was. How revered women were, and all of these things. And we're going to compare, what Haudenosaunee did versus the Algonquins did, or what these people did, And so it's like a timestamp of 200 years ago, not ever showing, okay, well, here's because we governed in such a way, or because our culture represented this is how we confronted this, and this is how we confronted that. And then let's tell the truth about what we gave up, how corrupted even our culture became because of male dominance and the male dominance cultures of Europe and that kind of stuff. I mean, if I talk to somebody who even went to school here in the public schools, but took Seneca culture classes, they are taught about Seneca culture with a timestamp of 200 years ago or even longer ago. They don't talk about the Sullivan campaigns.
No,
they don't even talk about corn planter era and the red jacket era. They don't talk about again Levi General, the Sagahe, or they don't talk about any of that stuff. They don't talk about our fight, against Kinzua, none of that stuff. We do a commemoration, but again, we are not empowering our kids to know.
It commemorates it as being right, and therefore they celebrate it.
Yeah.
Just to let you know, I was teaching Seneca language at the Gowanda High School, and before I could do the first class, the principal said that I had to sign this, and he presented me with this form. And what it was, I read it, and it said that I pledged loyalty to the state of New York and the curriculum that they taught. And I said, why do I have to sign this? He said, well, it's a requirement. They'd been doing it since the 1950s when there were all these communists running around the U.S., supposedly. So I wrote a form for him. He was supposed to sign it, okay, and date it, that he was going to be loyal to the Haudenosaunee and to the Anundawaka.
Yeah.
And if he didn't want to sign this one, I wouldn't sign his. And he said he couldn't sign it. So I said, okay, that's no problem. I won't sign this one.
Hey, we're at the bottom of the hour. We'll take a break and come back. But I get there's more to discuss on this, and I think it's important to again give credit where credit is due for the resistance of the past. Even as I think we seem more armed and better to take on battles today. I don't think we can ignore the lines in the sand that those before us drew that we seem to be ignoring. So we'll talk about more of that when we come back. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler, and this is Let's Talk Native.
All right.
Sun comes up on another day. Same faces smiling my same way. I know she feels the same way too. Damn, it's just you. Well, maybe I'm not the romantic kind. No candlelight dinners and no fine French wine. I love you, baby, but I forget to say. I know it's wrong, but I'm just that way. Feel the light, feel the light. Something going on. Feel the light, and it feels like we got trouble in the way. I'm here to tell you it wasn't always this way. You used to call me baby 10 times a day, and now the only call I ever get from you is from the bar. Half past 2. Feel the light, feel the light. Something going on. Feel the light, and it feels like we got trouble in the wheel. Are we grasping and strong? I still love you, that means anything at all. If you still want me, baby, give me a sign, and I'll be yours, honey, you be mine. Feel the light, feel the light. Something going on. Feel the light.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. I've got Ed Schindler in studio. Good to have you back, Ed. We've missed you. It's ironic that I call you or I message you and I say, hey, when you come back down? You said next week. So I picked you up at the airport on Tuesday, and we got to hang out a little bit today. So it's good to have you back. Look, we've had it's been an interesting run on the show. Matt's been really tied up, so he hasn't been in the show in the studio as much. But I've had an opportunity to address a lot of issues, and of course, it's great to have you bounce some of this conversation back and forth, especially as we're talking about some of these things in the past. Because you, even though you're not that much older than me, you were very much involved and very engaged in some of what was happening within the Seneca Nation, even at a young age.
Yes.
So you were hanging around some of the older folks who were empowered and who had not only in positions of influence, whether it's through Seneca Nation government, but influence through culture. I think you've had an opportunity to to be involved in some of those discussions, even at a fairly early age. So, hey, before I get back into it, let me do my obligatory mention to my sponsor. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE Family of Businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, Legacy 420 in Tandanega, Mike General with Mikey Cheese and Mikey's Emporium, and I want to thank the individuals who help. Got friends like Ed Schindler here, my good friend Cynthia Trice and Roger Jock and Neville Spring, and many others who have helped this program continue to educate, entertain, and inform for the last 8 years. I thank all of you for joining in the fight and doing your part. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. And again, thank CKWE. It is the radio station in Tandanega that simulcasts and rebroadcasts this show. I want to thank the internet networks as well. Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, Indigenous Resistance Radio. I want to thank you all for carrying Let's Talk Native on your networks. I also want to thank all of you who have group pages that accept our post of the show, because we share the show through many of the Native pages and pages that are relevant to Indigenous issues. And not everybody necessarily appreciates having the show being inundated with my opinions on their pages, but those of you that do and allow us to post, I thank you all, because the conversations that we have, our hope is that the conversations continue. And we do try to address issues that oftentimes get glossed over because of history. And I think what we're talking about tonight is important because, again, we look at ourselves as activists today. Back in the day, the folks who were drawing the line, they didn't even call themselves activists. They were just doing what they thought was right. Now, I mean, you almost have to single out the people who are willing to fight for something, and not just fight against something. And we mentioned that earlier too in our conversation, but fight for something. Unfortunately, because we have so many things that are being pressed on us or oppressed upon us, I say, we do oftentimes begin some of these conflicts with fighting back, fighting against something. But oftentimes the reason we're fighting against an imposition of a road or a highway or a pipeline or rail or whatever is because we are fighting for something, our land use, our future. And when I look back again and I think about these fights that have happened in the past that I don't think many of us today consider. Again, I know Matt had posted that he pulled up the research from 232 and 233. He knows that it was unanimous that the Seneca Nation was in opposition to 232 and 233. I know the resistance that came, and I've seen some of the letters that were written about the Citizenship Act, even from Onondaga and other places. We stood up against all of those incursions and those this idea of trying to subject us to their laws and to their will. We've always stepped up and fought. Now, we can argue that we didn't persevere and we didn't fight those things successfully, but that's only if you consider an end of the fight. And the problem is, even though those lines were drawn by people in the past, shame on us for not picking it up. And again, when I think about the Citizenship Act in particular, if you go on to many territories, even on the Canadian side too. I mean, so when you think about how many places have Native people in it who are loyal to their oppressors, without even getting into the military service thing, because sometimes that's not about loyalty to flag and country as much as it is, acting out because of having very little opportunity within the economies that were left to us through, by creating, our impoverished territories. But the idea that we can have so many flag-waving, patriotic Native people on the U.S. and the Canadian side, it's almost like we're slapping those people in the face who oppose the Citizenship Act, who oppose the Indian Act, who oppose these things. And I think we need to revisit some of that stuff, because I think we have to stand up we have to pick up the fight that those who came before us had the lines that they had drawn in the sand. The biggest problem is we've ignored those things and we've moved on to, maybe things that have more commercial appeal, like, fighting for our regulatory advantages, and I'm not opposed to that. I'm not opposed to fighting the state over taxation or the federal government over, regulatory authority and taxation. I'm not opposed to fighting that. But even when we do something, even when we got into gaming, for instance, we didn't ask for permission when we did it, but as the federal government started trying to squeeze us, we pulled all the pull tabs out of our shops, right? We stopped. Mm-hmm. There were a few people who even did slot machines. No, we got scared of the charge, and in fact, folks like Barry Snyder had to plead guilty. His lawyers advised him to plead out, take a plea bargain on gaming. They had no authority to enforce these gaming violations against Native people, and even as we decided to, in many of our territories to get involved in higher stakes gaming, like casino gaming, we found it more comfortable to operate under a federal statute than to operate solely on our own sovereignty and autonomy, on our own right and free and independent right to do some of these things. And so we compromise ourselves. We compromise the very things that some of the folks before us tried to fight and didn't have really the luxury that we have today. Today, we know we can strongly put up an opposition to the state and not have to fear that they're just going to come in and mow us down with Hotchkiss guns or whatever else. We know that the state is limited because the eyes of the world are upon them. And it's not because the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples protects us, but the court of public opinion does. So even though we can mount a peaceful and strong at the same time resistance to state imposition, we seem to drop the ball. I even revisiting New York State trying to suggest on the tobacco fight that they have the right to tax our sales on our territories. That's the language that they use. And what they're saying is that they could pre-collect a tax on premium brands before they come to our territories through the New York State wholesalers. And so they keep saying this thing. There was a recent New York State Supreme Court ruling that upheld the previous New York court ruling that the state could force New York State wholesalers to stamp the product that comes to our territories. Of course, we don't buy most of that product. That's not where the product comes from anymore. But the fact of the matter is the state is still saying publicly they have the right to tax the sales on our territories if it's to a non-native person. Well, and that's simply wrong. But, we remain silent on it. And even it almost doesn't matter what the court rules because there's a ruling and there's also this thing called force of law. Is it enforceable? There are laws that have been passed that actually could be considered void for vagueness or be voided because of they're unenforceable. And the fact of the matter is, New York State cannot come onto our territories and enforce their right to collect taxes on our sales. They can say it all they want, and they can say, okay, yeah, but what we mean is we're going to pre-collect the tax when New York State wholesalers supply you. Well, but we're not going to buy from New York State wholesalers then. See, we miss the argument. And so even as we do what we need to do to advance maybe some business opportunities and that kind of stuff, we seem to compromise ourselves along the way. And I think this is the challenge. Look, I'm not trying to throw everybody today under a bus, just like I'm not trying to throw everybody in the past under a bus. I think there are strong stands that were made before us, and there are strong stands that we've been able to make. Unfortunately, the two don't jive. And that, I think, is the crux of what I wanted to talk about today. Because I want to give credit to the resistance that was put up by the people who came before us and give credit to the people who are resisting today. But at some point, I would like them to look at the same battles that either one side, conceded to, and which is not the same thing as surrendering, Right. I just think we have to revisit some of those fights in the past. And I think we absolutely need to stand up strongly against US 232 and 233. I'll tell you another one. and this kind of presented itself recently when the Seneca Nation first put out their paperwork on the summer youth program. One of the requirements they listed that you had to provide was if you were a male over 18 years old, you had to prove that you had registered for the selective service. You had to prove that you were in good standing with the draft. Mm-hmm. You know, and of course the Seneca Nation, not only should that have never made it into a Seneca Nation document, but to the contrary, the Seneca Nation should be staunchly opposed to any requirement that would suggest that that Senecas or any Native kids for that matter, Native boys should have to register, for the U.S. military industrial complex. I mean, it's absurd. But see, these are the kinds of things that we've become indoctrinated enough that we do these things without thinking, and then somebody will call it out, and then they'll try to make an adjustment or a correction.
Yeah, like the Seneca Nation ID card where it has a chip in there and all that stuff.
Yeah, but what was the first requirement?
You have to be either U.S. or Canadian citizen.
Proof of citizenship. One of the requirements to get what they called an ETC, an enhanced tribal card, was proof of citizenship. So,
and you only had two choices.
Yeah, and Seneca wasn't one of them, folks. I mean, because you should not have to provide proof of your status with Senecas, because that should all be on Seneca record, right? But what they said is you needed to provide proof of citizenship as a U.S. or a Canadian. You can get a Seneca ID card and not be a U.S. citizen, but you had to be a Canadian citizen. Now, how absurd is that? I mean, and I used to call these ETCs, I called them federal IDs that we get to put our logos on, because that's what they were. I mean, what an enhanced tribal card had on it was either an American or a Canadian flag on it. It might have said Seneca Nation of Indians on the top, but it had an American flag or a Canadian flag, and those flags were tantamount to a declaration of citizenship for those nations that those flags represented. I mean, the Seneca Nation actually developed these ETC cards, and it's been an utter failure. I think less than a couple of hundred people went and got them. And the whole idea of an enhanced tribal card, it was supposed to help with crossing the border. The problem is Canada was under no obligation to accept an ETC, an enhanced tribal card, as a legitimate travel document. So the only thing an enhanced tribal card could do is if you found yourself in Canada, which means you had to have other U.S. documentation to get there, you could use your ETC to get back. But the other thing that it did, it actually created a tracking device for the federal government, because they're between the RFID chip in the card itself and the scannable barcode on it. They could essentially determine your whereabouts anytime you ever pulled that card out. Anytime you would have to go, anytime you tried to use it, it would track your position, just like they're worried about cell phones, right? Yeah, it's the same thing. So I mean, look, I think what we what was it? What I'm saying. Mike General's posting here. It says proof of citizenship is also required for an SGA license. I mean, again, how bizarre is that? How, the fact that we can't even acknowledge our own identity. We need this, that even, and again, I'm not trying to pick on the Seneca Nation. I mean, we're broadcasting for Seneca Nation, so this is the feedback that we get, right? But the same thing exists in Akwesasne. The same thing exists in a lot of these places. I mean, look at the debacle that is in Onondaga, for instance, with the quote-unquote Haudenosaunee cards, passports. I mean, look, the standard for getting a Haudenosaunee passport, it has more to do with lacrosse than anything else. Mm-hmm. If you're a lacrosse player, you can get a Haudenosaunee passport. There's this whole battle that's going on about whether the Iroquois nationals should go play lacrosse in Israel, especially in light of the atrocities that Israel has been committing for almost forever against Palestinians, but more recently the absolute disproportionate use of violence that the Israeli military has displayed against Palestinians in Gaza. is reason enough to boycott or be a part of the BDS, the boycott, divest. I don't know I can't remember what S stands for. BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. I mean, but certainly we should. But it turns out the Iroquois Nationals may not go, but it has nothing to do with taking a stand on violation of human rights. It has more to do with the fact that the Haudenosaunee passports are being constructed to be compliant with the United States standards. They're WITI compliant or WITI compliant. When I say WITI, I mean Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. And in other words, Department of Homeland Security. These aren't cards that are our travel documents. They are documents that are meant to conform with the United States Department of Homeland Security. So, again, it's gonna be like the enhanced tribal cards. It's essentially a U.S. passport that we get to put Haudenosaunee on the front of. It has the same kind of RFID chip, the same kind of electronic tracking that a U.S. passport has. It is not, and we don't control the data.
Right.
I mean, so again, when I think about the line in the sand that we draw today versus, frankly, some of the folks that came before us made in spite of the lack of worldliness, I guess, or what people want to say, a global sophistication that some of the leadership before us had, they made a stronger and more compelling argument about resisting the will of the state and the federal government than we do today. And I think that we mount a much stronger physical resistance. I think we can pile out on the highway, and we can puff out our chests, and we can do marches, and we can unify with other Native people and non-Native allies. We can pull a bunch of people together, but we're ignoring some of the very language that some of the folks before us were articulate and intelligent enough to lay out before us.
Earlier today, we were talking about some of the things that you would want to teach to the people because of how well it was used by the Haudenosaunee. And we were talking about communication, okay? In the communication, you want to do it in a manner in which you're going to learn from each other and learn about not only each other, but yourself especially. But then we got talking about, instead of fighting against everything, what are we fighting for?
Right.
And I think that's really important, because you take a look at what we've been talking about, those ID cards. What that does is it literally identifies you as U.S. or Canadian. Mm-hmm. If you do that because it's something you do on your own, it's not something they require, it's something that a person volunteers to do, you are literally putting yourself under their jurisdiction and under their laws. And the same thing's true if you were to use an American travel.
Passport or whatever. WITI compliant.
WITI compliance. What you're doing is you're basically putting yourself under the U.S. And those are the things that we got to pay attention to, is what do we want, not what do we not want, what do we do?
And that's just it. We have the right to create our own travel documents. Right. And control the data associated. Look, it's not to say that we can't create a document that the federal government can't verify as a legitimate identification, or a state or a law enforcement department or another country. Absolutely. But we have the right to create those travel documents. And we don't necessarily have to meet a U.S. standard. We can look at the international community. Mm-hmm. And so these are the things that I think we have to consider. I mean, one of the things that's disturbing is, as much as we put up resistance in 1924 to this imposed Citizenship Act, when there was some concern about being able to travel across the Canadian border because to play lacrosse or whatever else, many of our people just went out and got a U.S. passport, or on the other side got a Canadian passport. I've got family members that went out and got a Canadian passport. If I'm going to have trouble at the border, I'm going to go get a Canadian passport. Never even thinking, do you know that there's people who fought against this before you? And now, just because you're afraid it's going to tie you up at the border for 15 or 20 minutes too long? I mean, we could have inundated their border checkpoints. We could have said, no, I got all day. And we could have forced them without doing anything violent, just by saying, no, I'm not going to give you those documents. We don't have those documents. And, even on the quote unquote Canadian side, what they use for ID cards are federal ID cards. They're INAC cards. It's Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. I mean, we don't even, the individual territories don't even necessarily produce their own documents. It's the Canadian federal government that creates them. And which is kind of what the enhanced tribal card on the U.S. side was pledging to do. So, I mean, and again, part of what I wanted to discuss on this show specifically was we do need to have a different approach to asserting our identity, to documenting who we are, and look, we do live in a world that paper documentation or some form of documentation matters. Of course, now with everything from retina and scanning and all kinds of other things, there's any number of ways that we could approach this going forward. But the fact of the matter is, we need to assert. It's a good point, Mike General saying we need a birthing center. I mean, we need to produce our own birth certificates, regardless of whether we're born in a hospital in Buffalo or Dunkirk or anything else. There's no reason that we can't produce our own birth certificates, our own citizenship documents. I don't mean a tribal ID. I mean citizenship documents. And maybe even citizenship isn't the best word. But we should be able to create our own forms of identification, and frankly, for the cost of staffing an office that would keep track of all this. So if somebody ever wanted to verify and verify is such and such who they claim to be, I think we should be able to do that. But that's an example of of kind of what we're talking about here. And look, I applaud, as I've looked back at history, some of the documentation, some of the written resistance and documented resistance that people had presented before us. And I applaud the resistance that our generation has represented in terms of fighting back especially against the state. But again, the problem is we have ignored some of the battles of the past, and we've moved on to battles that perhaps have more commercial value. But they don't. You cannot continue to go down that path and use words, like I said, like decolonization, if we're not going to revisit some of those impositions that the folks before us knew what the fight was. They just didn't have necessarily they didn't have the same strength that we have to fight it. And like I said, I think their opponent was a little bit more ruthless. I don't want to say just stronger, but they were more ruthless.
Yes.
So, I mean, again, I think this is something that we should take pride in. Some of what the people before us did. Look, there were flaws in what they did. I mean, I'm not a fan of how over history the Guyana de Goa got trampled upon by people who were corrupted by the male dominant culture of Europe. I'm not crazy about how many territories dropped the clan system for as a way to resolve conflict under the Guyana de Goa, and then picked up some aberration of it by empowering a few men as chiefs. We've seen the corruption that men can participate in. We see it all the time, and that's what we've witnessed with our culture. And when people say that, the Seneca Nation replaced the chief system with a constitutional system, well, yeah, they did. And the problem was they never should have had a chief system. It should have been a clan system. And we see that in all of our territories, and that's what so many territories are fighting with on the on the Canadian side as well. Ed, I want to thank you for joining me. I know you're going to be around, so we'll keep you coming back, and we got a lot to talk about over the summer here. So I look forward to it. Look, that's it for us tonight. I want to thank you for listening, and hey, keep the conversation going. Do some research. Find out a little bit more about some of the things we're talking about. I think you'll be impressed. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.
Down the hill.